Today we are presenting the clinical grand round of Department of Maternal and Reproductive Health, and the topic is pregnancy complicated with neurological disorders, maternal and fetal concern. The broad outline of our topic, which we will touching today, are the introduction, classification, neurological affection addressing maternal and fetal concern, our experience, and key takeaways. So the neurological disorders in pregnancy are an important cause of morbidity and mortality, and the prevalence of neurological disorders in pregnancy is 1,115, 1 lakh deliveries. It encompasses a broad spectrum of conditions which may be affected by pregnancy, present de novo in pregnancy, or are caused by the pregnancy itself. The neurological assessment can distinguish between neurological symptoms that are common in pregnancy and those that might indicate a more significant disorder. There is less information available about the safety of neurological treatments and investigations in the pregnancy and the fetal and maternal outcome. The effect of maternal treatment on fetus makes the diagnosis and management often difficult task. It should be a multidisciplinary approach with need expertise of obstetrician, neurologist, neurosurgeon, anesthesiologist, and neonatologist. There are some physiological changes in nervous system also during pregnancy. In antepartum period, it could be nausea, vomiting, mental irritability, sleeplessness, or in postpartum period, it may be depression, psychosis. And the changes in the anatomy and functions are in anatomy. There may be decreased brain size and adenohypophyseal enlargement. Functionally, there could be presence of pain and paresthesia in hand and arm, which is known as carpal tunnel syndrome, and paresthesia and sensory loss over the anterolateral aspect of thigh. So these are the physiological changes present in nervous system during pregnancy. So neurological disorders has been divided in tumors, seizure disorders, cerebrovascular accidents, disorder of development, neurological infections, degenerative disorders, and headache and facial pains. So according to the incidence of neurological disorders in childbearing population, the migraine is the commonest one, which is found 1 in 5, followed by epilepsy, that is 1:150, and the least common is Guillain-Barré syndrome, that is 1.5 in 1 lakh deliveries in childbearing population. So now I would like to invite my senior resident, Dr. Ruchika, to present the further presentation.
Morning, respected teachers and my fellow colleagues. I'll be discussing the first part of presentation, that is neurological disorders affecting pregnancy. Pregnancy complaints which can mimic the underlying neurological disorders. That is headache, vomiting, backache, and seizures. A very common complaint in pregnancy is that of headache. This cannot be taken lightly, as was proven by a patient 24-year-old primary gravida, known case of rheumatic heart disease, presenting at 14 weeks gestation with a complaint of headache since 2 weeks and a history of double wall replacement at 10 weeks gestation. Now, the preceding events in this case were that she was diagnosed to be a case of NYHA class 4 due to rheumatic heart disease, and henceforth was planned for double wall replacement. An incidental diagnosis of 2 months of pregnancy was made at the same time, and the subsequent risks to the fetus were explained. The patient opted for double wall replacement, and she was discharged later on from an aspirin. She presented with a persistent intractable headache at 14 weeks gestation since 2 weeks. It was refractory to medications, and a neurology consultation was made. On examination, the patient had a regularly irregular pulse and artificial clicks in the mitral and aortic areas. INR at that time was 3.05, and MRI showed the diagnosis of acute SDH of 15 mm with a midline shift of 17 mm. As can be seen in the film showed here. So the provisional diagnosis was made of primary gravida with 14 weeks pregnancy with intracranial hemorrhage, history of double wall replacement on anticoagulation. Oral anticoagulants were stopped the very same day. Preoperatively, the INR was found to be 1.69. The potential risks to the fetus were explained, and patient was taken up for evacuation of subdural hematoma under GA. She was later on discharged on antiepileptics and oral anticoagulants. On subsequent antenatal follow-up, an ultrasound done at 26 weeks of gestation showed dilatation of stomach extending through the duodenum, through the jejunum, but not beyond that. Thus, the likelihood of possibility of fetal jejunal atresia was made. Also, the triple bubble sign was noted at 26 weeks. The fetus also had increased prenasal thickness. Thus, prenatal invasive testing was planned in view of raised risk of aneuploidy. Hence, switchover was done from oral to parenteral anticoagulation, and the reports of chordosynthesis done at 26 weeks were found to be normal. The patient was subsequently discharged on oral anticoagulants and antiepileptics. She was admitted at 36 weeks, 2 days gestation with ultrasound finding of asymmetric FGR. INR at that time was 3.72, and again switchover was done from oral to parenteral anticoagulation. Patient had to be delivered at 36 weeks, 5 days in emergency condition in view of fetal distress. A 1.8 kg male baby was delivered and was shifted to the ICU. Postnatally, the diagnosis of jejunal atresia was confirmed on, and the baby was operated for the same on day 2 of life. In the postoperative period for the mother, anticoagulation was again restarted with unfractionated heparin and overlapped with oral anticoagulants under the cover of monitoring of coagulation profile. She was later on discharged in a satisfactory condition. So a brief about the challenges we faced in such case in the timeline of a pregnancy. At 10 weeks, she was in NYHA class 4, had to be taken up for double ward replacement. So there were potential risks to the fetus because of surgery. There were risks to the mother if surgery would have been abandoned, and a potential possibility of warfarin embryopathy in the fetus. At 14 weeks, she presented with acute onset headache. Diagnosis of atraumatic SDH was made, for which evacuation was done. So mechanical valve needs an anticoagulation, and pregnancy itself predisposes to thrombosis. At the same time, an intracranial hemorrhage with a midline shift cannot be done without surgery. An incidental diagnosis of fetal jejunal atresia was also made at 26 weeks, for which prenatal invasive testing had to be done, and strict maternal monitoring for hemorrhage versus thrombosis was taken care of. Patient was delivered in emergency conditions at 36 weeks. Again, extremely strict maternal monitoring for hemorrhage versus thrombosis was kept in mind. So the differential diagnosis of headache, types of headache which we can encounter in pregnancy includes the most common being that of migraine. It classically improves during pregnancy and can have nausea and vomiting. Headache with preeclampsia and eclampsia can be a bilateral throbbing sort of a headache and can have blurring of vision and epigastric pain. Idiopathic intracranial hypertension can have visual field effects. Subarachnoid hemorrhage is classically described as the worst headache of life and can be associated with altered consciousness. Tumors can have foconeurological signs, and postdural headaches can be associated with neck stiffness. So warfarin was specially needed in our case as an artificial valve predisposes to thrombosis in about 4.7% cases. Pregnancy also inherently predisposes to thrombosis. But warfarin was a cause of concern as it caused a potential risk of warfarin embryopathy in the fetus, also led to the atraumatic SDH due to coagulopathy as was seen in our patient. So fine balance needs to be maintained. In all pregnant patients with prosthetic valve on anticoagulation, 50% hemorrhages can be major, having a mortality of up to 13.4%. Although this is the most effective anticoagulant, it can have teratogenic effects from 6 to 12 weeks in about 4 to 10% cases. So the principles of management in such a case would be immediate cessation of anticoagulation therapy, a consideration of reversal of anticoagulation, but at the same time, there's a potential risk of rebound hypercoagulability. According to AHA, we can start the oral anticoagulants after about 10 days of evacuation of intracranial hemorrhage. And according to Bertram et al., Safe window of about 1 to 2 weeks of discontinuation of anticoagulation after intracranial bleed can be considered. But there was bleeding in about 20% cases if therapeutic values were achieved, and embolism recurrence in about 20% cases if the therapeutic values were not achieved. So the key points in this case were, headache is a very common complaint in pregnancy, but it can be the only presenting feature of underlying neurological conditions. A sustained and stable anticoagulation is difficult in a pregnant woman due to inherent changes in the coagulation profile. Pregnant patients on anticoagulation should be strictly monitored for risk of thromboembolism versus risk of rebleed. And switching over of anticoagulants before any intervention is mandatory for better control in pregnancy. Next, we'll discuss a case of 22-year-old primary gravida with 26 weeks of gestation, presenting to our site with complaint of headache since 1 year, intermittent vomiting since 7 months, decreased vision since 4 to 5 months. Neurology consultation was made, and both pupils were found to be sluggishly reacting. There was bilateral primary optic atrophy on fundus examination, and MRI showed the finding of craniopharyngioma. As we can see in the axial and the sagittal films of MRI shown here, that there's a tumor in the sellar and the suprasellar region. Patient was taken up for left frontotemporal craniotomy and decompression of tumor by subfrontal approach at 29 weeks of gestation. Postoperatively, CT showed a near total excision of tumor with mild hydrocephalus. She also developed diabetes insipidus postoperatively, and later on she was discharged on day 21 on antiepileptics. So our roles and now in this case was, preoperatively we had to consider giving antenatal steroids so as to enhance fetal lung maturity. Intraoperatively, we gave prophylactic tocolytics such as the NTG patch used in our case, given to avoid premature uterine contractions and to prolong the pregnancy. And post-operatively, we intensively monitored the fetal and the maternal condition. So the clinical impact of antenatal corticosteroids in preterm delivery includes a risk reduction of about 34% in respiratory distress syndrome, 44% reduction in infection in the first 48 hours, 54% reduction in necrotizing enterocolitis cases, 46% reduction in cases of intraventricular hemorrhage, and overall risk reduction of about 40% in the neonatal mortality. So this is just an outlook of the commonly used tocolytics nowadays, most commonly still being the nifedipine, followed by nitroglycerin, as was used in our case. On serial ultrasonographic monitoring, we found asymmetric fetal growth retardation with oligohydramnios with abnormal umbilical artery indices in the Doppler, and hence the patient had to be delivered in emergency conditions at 37 weeks 3 days with the delivery of healthy baby of 2.44 kgs. Post-operatively on day 2, patient suddenly became drowsy and there was elevation of bone flap which was noted. An urgent neurosurgery call was made, for which ventriculoperitoneal shunting was planned for the patient. Later on, patient was discharged from neurosurgery. Very brief about craniopharyngioma. These are rare epithelial tumors of sellar and suprasellar region, and occurring in about 13 cases per 1 lakh people, predominantly affecting the adolescent age group. Only about 9 such cases have been reported in literature occurring in pregnancy. These tumors are benign but can behave very aggressively, and mostly they are asymptomatic but can be associated with sudden headache, nausea, vomiting, and signs of hypopituitarism. This is the overview of the review of literature which has been seen over the years, the last case being reported in year 2014. Similar findings were noted. Patients presented with complaints of visual problems or in some cases features of diabetes insipidus. And in the management part, in some cases they opted for induction for preterm delivery and definitive management was conducted in the postpartum period. And in some cases with severe deterioration, they had to go for antepartum definitive management for the tumor. So the learning points in this case were, we can postpone the surgery if there are no signs of deterioration. tocolysis and antenatal steroids are a must-do. And due to the demonstration of estrogen and progesterone receptors in the tumor cells, might explain the very aggressive behavior of craniopharyngiomas in pregnancy. Another very important complaint in pregnancy is that of backache. So a 28-year-old primi gravida with 33 weeks 4 days presented to our site with acute onset backache since 1 week. It was not responding to medication. Later, she developed tingling sensation and inability to move bilateral lower limbs. MRI done outside showed epidural hematoma at D10-11 level. A neurosurgery consultation was made for the same. There was 50% sensory loss below D12 level, 0/5 grading of power in the lower limbs, and plantar reflex was bilateral extensor. MRI showed hemangioma. So a diagnosis was made, primi gravida with 33 weeks 4 days pregnancy with paraplegia with D10, D11 spinal hemangioma. The same can be seen in the MRI T2 weighted sagittal view here. That is the location and the extent of the tumor at the D10, D11 level. The T1 weighted MRI spine sagittal view shows the increased vascularity surrounding the tumor, and the axial section shows the posterior lateral extent of the tumor causing compression of the spinal column. Coming on to the obstetric management we went for in this case, antenatally, steroid coverage was done for enhancement of fetal lung maturity and reducing the potential fetal complications. A collective team decision was taken for electively delivering the patient under GA at 34 weeks itself. This was done strictly in the view of maternal interest as there was progressive neurological involvement. A healthy baby was delivered and patient was then transferred to neurosurgery for further definitive management. A D9, D11 laminectomy with D5 left foraminotomy with total tumor excision was done, and at discharge, patient was improving symptomatically. Histopathology confirmed the diagnosis of hemangioma. So these hemangiomas are benign vascular lesions, rarely symptomatic, and pregnancy is a recognized risk factor, especially the third trimester. Usual location being the upper thoracic vertebra as compared to lower thoracic and lumbar in the non-pregnant patients. It classically begins as radicular back pain and leg paresthesia, progressing to spastic paralysis with incontinence within just a span of weeks. So pregnancy normally also alters the normal vascular hemodynamics, causing increased blood volume, increased venous obstruction, and increased flow through the vertebral venous channels, thus providing a ground for expansion of the pre-existing vertebral hemangiomas. So the collective effect of the hormones common in pregnancy, that is progesterone, estrogen, and relaxin, causes a growth promoting effect mainly through the structural changes in the vessel wall. There are certain factors which can affect the treatment in such cases, including location of the spinal cord compression, speed of neurological decline, gestational age of pregnancy, and potential risk to the fetus from the various treatment options. So we generally do opt for radiation therapy in a non-pregnant patient, but this is relatively contraindicated in pregnancy. There are newer modalities such as stereotactic surgeries, which can be safe in pregnancy, but are yet to become a mainstay. Surgery still remains the mainstay, providing immediate and direct decompression of the spinal canal. So the options which we had in managing such kind of a case, either we can go for induction for preterm delivery, but this puts the fetus at risk, or we can opt for expectant observation since we are expecting improvement after the delivery. In such cases, we have to keep in mind that active mobilization of the patient is necessary for preventing the venous stasis. But if at any point of time there's severe neurological deficit, we should immediately go for surgical decompression. If we opt for antepartum surgery of the tumor, we have to keep risk of recurrence with the future pregnancies in mind. So the key points in this case were backache, if refractory to medication, should be evaluated further. Due to the extremely aggressive nature of these tumors, if we go for antepartum surgery, then this surgical decompression is usually subtotal, resulting in about 30% recurrence. And because of this recurrence, early postpartum intervention should be done. Our next case is that of 29-year-old female, Primi gravida, 34 weeks, 1 day gestation. She was a staff patient and was antenatally supervised at the general hospital throughout the pregnancy. She presented with a single episode of generalized tonic-clonic seizures with altered sensorium, preceding by headache and vomiting since 3 days. An emergency MRH consultation was sought at 34 weeks, 1 day gestation due to one episode of GTCS associated with confusion and slurring of speech. So the provisional diagnosis of eclampsia was made on the basis of clinical suspicion. The previous BP records were found to be normal, and there was no history of blurring of vision, epigastric pain, and pedal edema. On examination, the patient was found to be semi-conscious. Her GCS was E3V3M5, and blood pressure at that time was 166 by 110 mm of Hg. Obstetrically, her per abdomen examination was corresponding to the gestational age. By that time, a second episode of seizure occurred. After the initial primary emergency management, she was given an injectable antihypertensive followed by Mexalf under the recommended protocol. Simultaneously, relevant investigations were also sent. As a third episode of seizure occurred, half of the magnesium sulfate dose was again covered. A collective decision was taken for emergency delivery of the patient in view of fetal bradycardia. And this was done under general anesthesia at General Hospital itself. A female baby of around 2.02 kgs was delivered and was shifted to the NICU. Patient was subsequently extubated but remained semi-conscious. Hence, she was shifted to the ICU preemptively, but she again had recurring seizures and had to be re-intubated. As you can see in the investigations of the patient shown here, that the platelet count, creatinine, electrolytes, urine routine microscopy, and transaminases all were within normal limits. So further evaluation was planned for the patient. The diagnosis was made on CECT brain, right frontotemporoparietal acute subdural hematoma. And on further probing, patient's attendant also gave a history of fall of the patient in about 3 days back. So the patient was planned for evacuation of hematoma on day 2 postpartum. She was later on discharged on antiepileptics. The differential diagnosis of new onset seizures in pregnancy can be either pregnancy induced or there can be other causes of seizures. Pregnancy induced including eclampsia and acute fatty liver of pregnancy. Other causes can be epilepsy, infections, metabolic causes, tumors, drug withdrawals, hemorrhage, and psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. Eclampsia is classically described as new onset of GTCS with preeclamptic features occurring at more than 20 weeks gestation, BP being more than equal to 140 by 90 mmHg along with proteinuria, although this criteria no longer remains essential. Other features can include deranged RFT, LFT, CNS changes, thrombocytopenia, electrolyte abnormalities, and serial Doppler ultrasonographic monitoring needs to be done to look for fetal growth retardation. A seizure in pregnancy is most likely to be either due to epilepsy or eclampsia, with the incidence being 60 in 10,000 and 5 in 10,000 pregnancies respectively. Incidence of eclampsia in India is up to 3.7%. Antepartum, there can be eclampsia in about 38% cases and 44% cases in the postpartum period. The recurrence of eclampsia is in about 2%, and trauma complicates 7% of all the pregnancies. So when we opt for further evaluation of a patient in such case, the first and foremost point we have to keep in mind is 40% of women with eclampsia having a seizure can have it at a normal blood pressure and without proteinuria. So after primary stabilization of such a patient, a detailed and complete evaluation is crucial to differentiate eclampsia from other disorders. So we have to look for precipitating events, mode of onset, detailed symptoms and signs, and further evaluation on the basis of laboratory studies and neuroimaging studies. So the broadline management of such a case would be, if there's a new onset seizure in pregnancy, we assume it to be eclampsia until and unless proven otherwise. So we go for primary stabilization of patient, magnesium sulfate under the recommended protocol, and termination of pregnancy. If there are certain atypical features or it worsens with the management, then we have to go for further workup to rule out CNS, hemorrhage, infection, and metabolic disorders, etc., or rule out the other causes of new onset seizures in pregnancy. This can be done by EEG, neuroimaging studies, lumbar puncture, ECG, and echocardiography. Just a brief about management of subdural hematoma in pregnancy. This is divided according to the gestational age. In less than 26 weeks, we can only focus on the maternal health. More than 34 weeks, we can address both the mother and the fetus by termination of pregnancy. And in between, we can go for individualized case management. So to conclude this case, a seizure in pregnancy is eclampsia until proven otherwise. This is even true for a woman with known epileptic disorder. Any new onset seizure in pregnancy not responding to standard protocol of management should be reevaluated for other causes. About 10% of patients with eclampsia can be refractory to magnesium. In such cases, we can consider giving first-line anti-epileptic drugs. And in general, overall, termination of pregnancy is the rule, irrespective of gestational age. In cases of refractory status epilepticus, as recurrent seizures can be detrimental to both the mother and fetus. Now I'll hand over the second part of the presentation to Dr. Shweta for discussion.
Good morning, everyone. Now I will present the neurological disorders with fetal concerns, and we have divided these cases into acquired group and inherited group. In acquired group, we have a case in which maternal intake of drug has caused fetopathic effects, whereas in inherited group, we have 3 cases in which the diagnosis was facilitated by detailed history, examination, and investigation. The first and foremost case is of a patient presenting to us at 19 weeks of pregnancy with improper seizure control. The patient took sodium valproate throughout her entire first trimester, and there was no history of periconception folic acid intake. The patient came to us at 19 weeks and anomaly scan was done. Spina bifida was found out, prognosis of which was explained to the couple, and they opted for termination of pregnancy. As we can see in this ultrasound images, in the sagittal section, coronal section, and axial section, that there is a large lumbar lesion. And the last image is of the same baby at autopsy, showing a large neural tube defect. She had a similar obstetric history in the past, with the baby affected with neural tube defect. That baby had lumbosacral meningomyelocele and was operated at 3 months of life. As we all know, the anti-epileptic drugs are either category C or category D and cause fetopathic effects, the maximum of which is associated with valproic acid, that is 4 to 14%, which causes neural tube defects, orofacial clefts, and etc. So if any patient in reproductive age group and on anti-epileptics comes to us, then we have to counsel her about good control of seizures even before conception, the importance of taking folic acid periconceptionally because it prevents neural tube defect by 70%. And if the previous baby is affected by neural tube defect, then we have to tell them that there is a risk of recurrence of 3 to 5% in the next pregnancy also. And if the mother is affected with idiopathic generalized epilepsy, which are known to have genetic predispositions, then the baby is also at a risk of developing similar epilepsy in 4 to 5% of cases. And if the patient is on multiple drugs, then we have to change to a single one and prefer as low dose as possible. The first case in our inherited group, and we can see the importance of history taken in this case. This is a primary patient referred to us at 13 weeks of gestation in view of fetal concern of affection. And there was a history of gait abnormality in paternal side of family. On detailed family history, we saw that multiple members of every generation were involved and both the sexes were involved. We draw a pedigree of the entire family and we can see that all the generations are involved as well as both the sexes of the family are involved. And the age mentioned here is of the age of onset. And we can see this age has decreased as we proceeded from one generation to the other generation. So a detailed history of the husband was taken and he told that this disease has started at the age of 17 years. Initially, there were arm tremors which progressed to gait abnormality. and it pointed toward the possibility of spinocerebellar ataxia. And mutation analysis was done. Spinocerebellar ataxia type 12 was found out. Later, prenatal invasive testing was done for the fetus, and the baby was also found to be affected with the same mutation, but with more number of CAG repeats. The couple was counseled and they opted for termination. The key points associated with spinocerebellar ataxia are that type 2 is most common in India, whereas type 3 is most common worldwide. This disease do not have any specific antenatal manifestation, and it exhibits the phenomena of anticipation, as we already seen in the pedigree, that an earlier age of symptoms and increasing severity of disease as we proceed from one generation to the other generation. The second case in our inherited group is of a primary patient presenting to us at 38 weeks in active labor in emergency. We can see the importance of examination in this case. On examination, we saw extensive multiple non-tender nodular lesions of variable size all over her body and presence of Cafalot patches, which suggested to a possibility of neurofibromatosis. The patient gave a history that these lesions have been present since childhood and they flared during pregnancy. An emergency section was planned because of meconium stained liquor with fetal distress, and special care was taken to avoid any neurofibroma in stitch line. An alive and healthy female baby of 2.4 kg was born. This is the image of the same patient with the baby. As we can see the lesions all over her body and the presence of Cafalot patch in the baby also. If this patient would have presented to us earlier, then there was a possibility of prenatal diagnosis. Neurofibromatosis is a genetic neurocutaneous disorder presenting in 1 in 3,000 individuals. And during genetic counseling, we have to tell that 50% of these mutations are de novo. Prenatal invasive testing can be offered, and we have to tell that normal obstetric outcome is possible in this case. Pregnancy affects this condition by promoting growth of new neurofibromas in 60% of cases, whereas 52% have reported pre-existing neurofibromas. Malignant transformation and occasional sudden hemorrhages can be seen. Whereas this condition affects pregnancy by causing first trimester spontaneous abortions, preterm deliveries, preeclampsias, stillbirths in 23%, fetal growth restriction 50%, and 36% increased risk of cesarean section. As can be seen in this review of literature, that there had been maternal complications like multiple fibromas, hypertension, and fetal complications like spontaneous abortions in first trimester, stillbirths, IUGR, and increased C-section rate. The final case in our inherited group is of a patient referred to us at 36 weeks of gestation in view of an ultrasound abnormality. She had a previous history of an early neonatal death, the cause of which was not known. In this pregnancy, she was referred with a fetal ultrasound suggestive of echogenic intracardiac focus. During ultrasound at our site, we saw multiple fetal intracardiac tumors in both the ventricles and septum, which suggested toward the possibility of tuberous sclerosis. As we can see in the ultrasound film also, there is presence of multiple tumors in the heart. On detailed examination of parents, father was found to be affected with adenoma sebaceum, suspecting towards tuberous sclerosis. The MRI was done, showing multiple cortical tubers, and it was further confirmed with molecular testing. An alive baby was born, and it was postnatally confirmed with molecular testing. Subsequently, this patient conceived for the third time, and as we already knew the mutation, we did an early invasive testing at 12 weeks. No mutation was detected in that pregnancy, and that pregnancy is ongoing. Tuberous sclerosis is a multisystemic disease causing the growth of benign hematomas in central nervous system, kidneys, and skin. And if it is present during pregnancy, then kidney involvement appears to be the single most important prognostic factor. It is an autosomal dominant condition, and it acts by suppression of the activity of mTOR pathway. And in 1/3 of cases, it is inherited, whereas in 2/3, it is spontaneous. Coming to the important fetal aspects associated with this case, that cardiac rhabdomyomas are the only antenatal sign, and if multiple rhabdomyomas are present, then there is more than 90% chance of this disease. Fetal echo should be done, and we have to also do fetal MRI to see the involvement of brain and renal parenchyma. And in known genetic mutations, we have to do prenatal testing. Most of these lesions are asymptomatic, but some may have heart failures or arrhythmias. But we have to rule out cardiac fibromas also. The prognosis is that it can cause arrhythmias, hydrops, and stillbirth in 20% of the cases. And if there is presence of cardiac tumors, then they usually regress in early life, whereas if brain tumors are present, then they keep on increasing in number and size. Now, this is the final conclusive table of our inherited group of cases, in which we have shown that only tuberous sclerosis had an antenatal presentation as cardiac rhabdomyomas, and in spinocerebellar ataxia as well as tuberous sclerosis, father was affected, whereas in neurofibromatosis case, mother was affected. So there is always an importance of examination of both the couple. Now coming to a very important aspect of our discussion, that is pre-conceptional counseling, which should focus on reproductive age group, especially before conception. And the ultimate aim is to improve the maternal and child health, thus leading to a healthy female being a healthy mother and giving birth to a healthy baby. In this, we aim to identify couples at risk of having offsprings with genetic disease. If there is a family history of genetic disorders, birth defects, or mental disorders, then we have to form a detailed pedigree and analyze it. And if genetic carrier disease status is present in one or both the partners, then we have to review entire medical records and counsel them accordingly. And after identification, we counsel that if the condition is autosomal dominant, then there is 50% chance of inheritance. And if it is autosomal recessive, then 20% chance of inheritance is there. And if genetic mutation is known, then we have to diagnose these mutations in an unborn fetus by various prenatal testing methods which are available. Now, I would like to share our experience of neurological disease in our OPD over a period of 1 year. This is an skewed data because most of the patients come once to our department and are lost to follow-up. The total obstetric patients which reported to us in 1 year are 4,452, and out of them, 47 were having neurological disease. Coming to the age distribution, most of the patients who came to us were in the age group of 20 to 30, followed by 30 to 40 years of age. 51% of our patients presented to us in second trimester, whereas 30% came to us in first trimester. We saw a wide spectrum of neurological disease, maximum of which was seizure disorder, that is 38%, followed by migraine, that is 23%. It was further followed with tumors and degenerative disorders. Most of the patients, that is 66% of our patients, reported the onset of symptoms before pregnancy, whereas 34% reported the onset of symptoms during pregnancy. The patients who had seizure disorder were advised levetiracetam in 9 patients, followed by carbamazepine, whereas one of our patients was on valproate. So the key takeaways from this presentation are that many neurological diseases are unmasked in pregnancy itself. So we have to maintain a very high suspicion even with common complaints. Proper history and examination facilitates early diagnosis and management. And if we are considering any inheritable disease, then we have to examine a couple as a whole. We have to modify the drugs, their doses, and switch to a more safer one before conception. Preconceptional counseling could be the cornerstone, which could lessen the financial and social burden associated with the neurological diseases affecting both the mother and baby. And we have to properly educate and counsel them regarding these diseases and the various prenatal tests which are available, which could reduce the anxiety and help the couple to plan their families accordingly. In the end, I would like to thank all our patients, Department of Neurosurgery, Neurology, Neonatology, Department of Radiodiagnosis and Anesthesiology. Thank you.